Okay, so just covering the subject of horizontal layouts versus vertical layouts, right? I want to break this down so we can think about this. So first, let's discuss the rule of thirds. I don't love the term rule of thirds because rule sounds like something that you should or shouldn't do. But when I think about composition, I very much liken it to music theory. This is how space interacts, right? That's really what we're talking about. So it's not so much that you should or shouldn't use the rule of thirds. It's just understanding that the rule of thirds is present in the compositions that you're doing. So first, let's go over the rule of thirds in some of these situations. So basically, the rule of thirds is just saying if you align your composition onto, evenly divided thirds, it's a pleasing composition. It's basically what it's saying, right? So let's explore that idea for a moment. So what rule of thirds is really talking about is the difference between symmetry and balance, right? If I go symmetrical, we have two equal sides and they're sharing equal tension. But once you add thirds, right? Let's pick a different tool for that. Once you break up something into a third, now the imbalance is what creates the pleasing composition, right? So if this is, say a whatever, it's a wall, right? And a person is leaning up against the wall, and you design it according to the rule of thirds, that's going to be a pleasing composition, right? The person's head is touching right on the rule of thirds. The wall is picking up a nice amount of negative space. Yet you have all this storytelling space for the character to interact with. So it's just generally pleasing. And so in that sense, I have nothing against the rule of thirds. The problem with the rule of thirds is that it's called the rule of thirds and most people treat it as such. This is just the way space interacts when you divide it. The same way there's no rule of fifths in music. It's not a rule. It's okay if you're 5 scale degrees away, this is how the sounds interact with each other. So that's number one, how you should think about it. That having been said, when you're actually designing a composition, it's not just about organizing space. It's about establishing a point of view, establishing a subject, and then having that subject interact with the space around them. So for example, so let's go right to the heart of it. So we'll leave the rule of thirds guidelines up here for a moment, but basically I can have my subject anywhere, right? And the space around the subject is going to give a different effect, right? So if I have the subject here on this thirds line, that's one effect. If I have the subject dead smack in the middle, the rest of the composition can still follow the rule of thirds, right? Like suppose they're standing in a doorway. Okay, cool. That's a different effect. I can also put my subject way over here, and they're not really interacting with the rule of thirds, but if there are windows in a hallway, that can actually still be participating in the rule of thirds. But what's really happening is our subject is going across the horizontal plane. And that's where their effect is mostly happening. Even if the subject were up here, down here, over here, this is still moving across the horizontal plane. Why? Because wherever the subject moves, there's a space created, right? So if the subject is here, then all of this space is where the tension is. If the subject is here, then all of this space is where the tension is, right? In these spaces and this space is where the tension is, right? And the same thing if the subject is over here, well, now this space is where the tension is going to be. So that's all that's happening with the rule of thirds, but in a horizontal composition, the subject moving across the frame is what's happening. In a vertical composition, the subject is moving up and down the frame. Now, this doesn't mean that the subject is literally moving up and down the frame. So for instance, I can have a subject standing here and they can be walking over here. However, the eyes of the viewer are moving through the frame in a more vertical way because there's more space, which means more tension. So same thing, say there's a rule of thirds and this is my ground in a vertical frame. Okay, so, and let's say there's some object here, whatever, let's say it's a big creature over here, right? We'll go fantasy for the sake of this example. Now the eye is still moving up to my subjects, and all of the space in here is housing the tension and is controlling the space. So it's the same rule, it's just knowing, or the same theory. It's just knowing that the viewer's eye is going to be moving more up and down. There's still going to be some across motion. Just like in this frame, there's still some vertical motion, right? We're going down and we're going up and that sort of thing. But it's just more dominant this way. So even if you're filming in more of a shorts or TikTok format, if you were, taking pictures or something like that, you're still following the same idea. Like, where's my subject? I can apply some rules of thirds here, right? I can apply opposing ideas with the subject and that sort of thing. And I can still also move that subject left and right and up and down. Like, I can put the subject way up here, right? Like, say the subject is up here and they're sitting down and it's like some grassy area, right? And a road leading up to the subject. So now what you've basically done is you've artificially created a horizontal frame inside of your vertical frame, but now you also have the benefit of all of this space here. And what I suggested to my friend, which I now also suggest to you guys, is look at fine art, because in art, we call this landscape and portrait, right? So look at fine art and how they manipulate the space and the compositions in fine art for the different shapes. And because this is what filmmakers do, right? And so use that to basically influence how you look at those decisions and manipulate your frames going forward. And I'm just gonna, throw some ideas around putting characters in different spaces, just showing different ideas and controlling these spaces, just basic shapes and so on and so forth. So that's really it. There's no real difference between vertical and horizontal frames. Inherently, it's still just dividing and organizing space. It's just more of how the eye moves inside of those frames. And the same thing would be true for any other frame, right? So the first art lesson I recommend most people learn is how to control space inside of a canvas and what's really happening. And even though that's a complex subject, the base idea is very simple. And the base idea is just that before you do anything, the outside space is the most important thing, right? So if that outside space is a traditional rectangular, either portrait or landscape space, fine. But suppose it's a video game controller, right? Suppose it's a skateboard. Suppose it's a t-shirt. Knowing what the space is important. A lot of people take that for granted. They think about the picture first as opposed to the space. Once you understand to think about what the canvas is before you even consider what's going on inside of it, then you can start learning how to divide the canvas into different spaces to move and lead the eye, because now you understand how that artwork is going to be viewed and what the limitations of that artwork is going to be, right? Like, and I compare it again to music. You would treat music very differently if you had a 3-minute song versus a 6-minute song versus a 12-minute song versus the score of a movie, which is essentially a 2-hour song, right? Or a 90-minute song. That's going to change how you move throughout dividing that time and organizing that empty silence into sound. The same thing is true for artwork. You're organizing empty space from negative space into positive space, right? And so you need to understand the space first, or acknowledge the space first. It's not really much to understand, but you need to acknowledge the space first and then divide it. So going back to the vertical composition idea, okay, so this is my space. How am I dividing it? Am I dividing it into thirds? Okay, am I dividing it into vertical thirds, which is viable? Am I dividing it into horizontal thirds, which is viable? Or am I using a combination of the two, which is also viable, right? And this will still result in many a pleasing composition. You have endless options to divide this space into different sort of things, still using the same guidelines and rules of thirds that you may have used before. It's just, it's just a different space. And any canvas that's different is going to follow the same idea. So when you're learning vertical compositions versus horizontal compositions, it's not really going between the two. It's just learning to understand to divide space, not to divide space according to specific rules that, people say, oh, this is how you make things look good. You make things look good by dividing space well, not by specifically rules of thirds or, okay, now I'm in a different, it's different now. So how, you know what I mean? Like, what do I do? No, it's always different, right? It's always a little bit different depending on what the space is, but you're just organizing space either way. There's no inherent difference. Whatever your canvas is, the eye is going to move differently through and across the canvas. All right. So that is the end of that topic.